So welcome to the concept of economics in crisis. I'm going to be going over in this video a brief overview of what economics is considered to be in crisis and economic mechanics. So let's take a look at this presentation. This is updated for NAMUN 2022, but inspired by the presentation made last year. So as a general roadmap of this presentation, we're first going to go through an introduction of economics. Second of all, categories of economic mechanics. Thirdly, the concept of resource control. Fourth, the role of crisis in all of this. And then fifth, a summary of this presentation. And this, as it says on the slide, it should all serve as a general overview of the role of economic mechanics in crisis committees at NAMUN. So to introduce what economics is in the general sense, economics in crisis sense refers to the distribution of resources, and this is going to vary across crisis committees in terms of how it's represented very, very vastly. For example, some committees may represent economic mechanics in an abstract sense, as in they may have a list of countries that have, or regions, and they each have GDP statistics, and one might have high GDP, one might have low GDP, and in that way they avoid getting into specific numbers. Other committees that have perhaps more of a focus on, much more concrete real world simulation, they may have a much more like numbers based approach to all this. So they may say that, okay, this one character has $75 million in the bank or $100 million in assets, and you have to spend X amount of money on achieving this one thing or doing this other thing. So these are just two different approaches. Neither one is correct or incorrect. It's just two different approaches, and for different types of committees, different approaches will work. And also as another aspect of this, these resource values might be hidden to some delegates, they might be available transparently to other delegates. This totally depends on who these delegates are, what the resources we're talking about are, and so on. This, just as a general overview, economics refers to any sort of resource in a crisis committee that can be consumed. So, in general, I'd say there are two categories of economic mechanics. There are resources and economic trackers. Resources refers to anything that is limited and can be depleted or consumed. And it's very, very commonly found throughout all crisis committees. So, for example, you could have money, political capital, natural resources, or other committee-specific concepts that are allocated among delegates or perhaps even held in common, but need to be used up in order to achieve different things. On the other hand, we have economic trackers, and these are trackers of and mechanics related to the macroeconomic conditions of the world of the crisis committee. And we had an example of that on the previous slide with the GDP of a particular region. And these are usually found in much more economically oriented committees, but you can find them in other committees as well that perhaps have a military focus or something like that. And as examples, we have GDP, unemployment, national spending or budgets, and the stock market. So let's go into resource control. The concept of resource control is very simple. It's just the idea that different types of resources are owned and controlled by different actors. So whoever owns or controls a given resource has the power to do what they wish with that resource within the confines of the crisis committee and crisis staff, the crisis staff's wishes, you could say. And this, like, the actions that are allowed to be taken are probably established near the beginning of the committee when the mechanics are introduced to the delegates. And the controllership of this resource or of any resource is usually able to be transferred between delegates through, of course, private directives. And as we'll see on the next slide, resource control also applies to public resources. So some resources might have multiple controllers. If you're talking about, for example, like public funds in a government or funding for a parliament that the parliament has access to, these might need public directives to be used. So if you have a parliament committee, then the parliament might need to pass with a majority of the votes a bill that or a resolution or a directive that makes use of public funds in order for those funds to be used up. So, but at the same time, a lot of these public resources may also have a representative who can take certain actions on behalf of the rest of the controllers. And in this case, that would be the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister may have some executive authority over these public resources. And it's important to note this, that all action that involves a resource, remember, that's one of the categories of economic mechanics. Any action that involves a resource must be conducted with the consent of crisis and through a directive, either a public or a private directive. Now, what is the role of crisis in forming or in coming up with economic mechanics, dealing with them during the conference, and all that? I would break it into 4 steps. First of all, researching, then planning, then tracking, and then finally contextualizing. And we'll go into exactly what this means in the context of NAMUN in each step. First of all, researching and planning. Don't need to worry about the exact screenshots. These are from last year, but essentially crisis staff members leading up to the conference, in the months leading up to the conference, they look into economic facts about their committees and then decide how to incorporate those facts into mechanics. And a lot of these statistics and these facts are going to be very similar between committees. A lot of them are going to be very specific to the committees that you're working on. And so some very common economic statistics that you'll find that are applicable to many different sorts of committees are population, life expectancy, GDP or projected GDP change, the main industries within a certain region or a certain nation, and then character-specific wealth or resources, for example, how wealthy a certain businessman, a certain politician is, or the currency and the exchange rate within a certain country. Of course, not all of these, or maybe even none of these, are going to be present in some committees that you're a part of. But these are just a few examples of the kinds of things, the general theme of the kinds of things that you would find in the researching and planning phase. And then, of course, the planning aspect of this is implementing this research into mechanics, figuring out a way to specifically come up with how the GDP, for example, affects the committee, or how you could say how the delegates of the committee will be able to spend their wealth in the committee. Like, do we have a number of resources that they can purchase? Do we have certain things that they can do, a list of things that they can do? A lot of this will come in the spreadsheet phase, as you may see on the right. Just basically concretely establishing the rules of the research is what I'd say planning is. Now we have the next step, which is tracking. This is during the conference. Crisis staff members must keep track of the changes in the allocation of resources. So this includes consumption, transfer, and loss or gain of resources. So resources can be consumed by delegates, to achieve certain things. They may spend money to accomplish something. On the other hand, resources can also be transferred, which means that delegates can send each other money in order for different deals and things like that. And then loss or gain of resources. That just comes down to income on the gain side, of course. Like if delegates have cash income or money that they earn as part of income, that needs to be tracked, or losses as part of perhaps crisis updates or different sorts of delegate actions that are being taken. So this is usually done in a spreadsheet created prior to the conference that everybody should be pretty familiar with by the time we come around to the conference. And remember that delegate actions that concern resources have to be conducted through directives. So anything that is just as part of like a note that a delegate writes to another delegate isn't concretely achieved until it's part of an actual private directive. And then the final stage is the contextualizing, which it refers to crafting crisis updates and arcs while being mindful of resource mechanics. So when these sorts of gains and losses in resources happen, when resources are transferred between delegates, or when they are consumed, all of this needs to be contextualized and put into the context of the crisis committee for future crisis updates in case delegates ask. Of course, not all of this information is going to be publicly available, but that is something that at least needs to be considered. So, crisis analysts and crisis staff members must ensure resources are changed to reflect committee occurrences. So that includes updates, but also what other delegates are doing. Perhaps that affects, other delegates in some way. Must consider, and you also must consider both delegate actions and crisis updates, as I mentioned. Also must make it clear to the relevant delegates what resource values are being affected and when. Sometimes you'd want to change things discreetly, but most of the time you probably want to tell delegates when and how drastically certain resources are being affected. And remember, ultimately, the goal of crisis is to create a story, and mechanics are kind of our tools, our narrative mechanics to make that happen. And that always needs to be kept in mind. So, as a summary, I'd say these few things. Economic mechanics can be either abstract or concrete, hidden or transparent. They can be resources or macroeconomic trackers, and they can be either privately or publicly controlled. Those are a few different, I guess you could say, axes upon which economic mechanics can be classified. Then resources, when they're affected, they must be affected through either crisis actions or directive. So crisis updates, public directives, private directives, anything like that. Those are the only ways in which resources can be affected. Then finally, crisis staffers, you guys, your role in all this is that you must research, plan, then track and contextualize in the realm of economic mechanics. And hopefully with all that being said, I hope that gives a relatively brief overview of economics in crisis and the role of crisis staff in all this as well. And of course, if you have any other questions, you can just reach out to me whenever you like. My name is Raza. I'm the crisis coordinator for the JCC, and I'm obviously willing to answer any questions you may have. This was just meant to be a general overview, and hopefully it helped to enlighten you a little bit in some way.